the exit seminar by Daniel Zhu, PhD student working with the biomimetics lab at the ABI. Dan joined us some years ago after finishing mechatronics engineering. I was very impressed by his project here, his Park4 project. He developed a skateboard that was you could control by leaning forward or backwards. So you could control its speed by the way you leaned on it. And he got it the right way around, because if you got it the wrong way around, it would be disastrous. You know, just imagine you lean this way and then something goes, whoo, goes out from under you. He got it the right way around. It worked really well. Dan's being quite an interesting character. He set a very high standard of dress in the lab too. Always looks always nicely dressed, and I've been trying to catch up to him, and I haven't been able to do that. So Dan's also when he started his PhD, he was wanting to build a bodysuit, and he'll probably tell you all about that. And he's kind of ended up in a slightly different direction. Very good PhD. After the first year or so, he was just away on his own and telling me what to do, which was a really good result. To finish it all off, his last paper has received something like 4,600 downloads from the Smart Materials, is it?
That's right. Yeah.
Site, and the Institute of Physics. They cited his paper as one of the picks for 2015. We've all received a very nice little thing to hang on the wall that celebrates this fact. So he's been quite a star performer there now, and I think he's broken some new ground that he's going to tell you about in this talk. In between talking about whatever the title of that was, it didn't sound like a PhD exit, but never mind. We'll find out. So I'll hand you over to Daniel Zhu.
Thanks, Ian. I had a lot of fun reflecting on the last couple of years, putting these slides together. I went through a whole bunch of email trails, photos, past presentations, and it was awesome reflecting on the memories, just all the things we've done over the last couple of years. And really this place has been my home. So a little bit of background on my PhD. So I did mine in just over 3.5 years, which I thought it was kind of good at one stage where it wasn't going to take off, but it did. And there were a lot of skills that I picked up while I was working in a business at the same time that I thought translated really well into my research. And so today I'd like to share with you some of those experiences of juggling between work, uni, and all sorts of other stuff. So sorry about the kind of layout. Literally this is working title, just finished 10 minutes ago. I think it's something like 170 something slides. So I'll go through them quick. So kind of growing up, here's me back at high school. I was the typical high school nerd. I did the Asian 5 subjects, that's your 3 science and your 2 maths, and I did English as well. I was really lucky that I went to a school that had a culture of excellence, and our school motto was per augusta ad augusta, which meant through hardship to glory. And that taught me a lot of things, including discipline, training really hard. And I remember running 10Ks before our hockey training started, and that was the kind of work we were doing. Just about every day after school we would go to after school classes, do extra work. And really the kind of friendship circle that I had, the word mediocrity was a really dirty word, and we never used that. So kind of some of the early jobs I worked on, my first job was totally a minimum wage job. I worked in a sheet metal factory. So I spent all day crimping cables, making cabinets, bending sheet metal plates. It was hard work. I remember every day at like 10 o'clock there was the morning interval, and they'll call smoko, and of course I don't smoke, but all the guys would gather around the car park, and I'll just go eat my peanut butter sandwich, jelly sandwich. What that taught me was that I didn't want to work in labor. So I finished that job. The next job I got was more of kind of like an online business, that not really a business, but a thing I was testing, and that was I had broken my iPod, and I didn't have any money to buy another one, so I just bought some spare parts and I took it apart and replaced my iPod. And then I realized, hang on a minute, I've learned something that potentially I could benefit from. And so I started buying lots and lots of broken iPods off Trade Me, fixing them and then selling them again. One of the things I realized was that got really competitive. Because every time when I'm bidding for these broken iPods, there were 5 or 6 other people bidding against me, and when we're selling iPods, there were the same people selling these iPods. And I couldn't find any way to differentiate what I was doing, and we were literally just cutthroating, competing on price, which is the worst form of competition. That taught me that I had to really move up the value generation chain. Then I moved on to university. I had no doubt that I wanted to be an engineer, and when I enrolled, I only applied for engineering, knowing that if I didn't get in, it was going to be a sign from God or something, and I was going to go join the army or something else. I had lots of fun at uni. I worked on the project that Ian talked about. This was my electric skateboard. Lots of fun. We spent too much time working on this to the point that me and my project partner included, we didn't actually apply for any job interviews throughout the whole year. And it came down to the end of the year and we were like, well, we got our A+, but where are we now for the next couple of years? At the same time, I was also kind of thinking, I'm not sure whether or not I want to go straight into a 9-to-5 desk job, and I kind of liked to spend a bit of time figuring out what I really wanted to do. And that was at the same time when Ian came along. When I first met Ian, he told me this thing called an artificial muscle. It sounded really cool, and I later realized that it's some kind of a technical buzzword that the community uses to get it published and feature onto the news. But it's actually called an artificial muscle because it was used for applications that would substitute real muscle tissue. So I'll give a little bit of background on that in a second. But first, a bit more about the lab. When Ian brought me into the lab, I saw these guys, Ben and Todd and Tom, all of these guys who were doing their PhDs, and they were just making and breaking stuff and working with high voltages, really cool stuff. And even though I had no idea what they were working on, I knew I wanted to be part of that. Ian literally single-handedly wrote my whole project proposal. I didn't understand a single word on it. And it was only when I first started on my first day that one of the guys, Andrew, he sat me down and he told me the basics 101, and I thought, oh, that's what I got myself into. So a little bit of background on what an artificial muscle is. So it's essentially a piece of rubber, and we put material over the top and the bottom of it, which conducts electricity, and that allows it to move when we give it a very high voltage. So that's an example of a fish robot that I made in my first year. So I touched on a couple of things working on robotics, and that was actually the initial proposal of my PhD, which ended up being nothing like what I did in my PhD. I had a lot of, the reason why I want to talk about some of the other stuff outside of my PhD was because I realized that a PhD could kind of go in lots of different directions. If you're lucky, you are exponentially going up. Often you kind of go up and then kind of never come out. But more realistically, you're going to have kind of setbacks once in a while, but as long as in the general direction, you're kind of moving up. This is an early diagram I saw about a PhD, and it just gives you a perspective on where your contribution really lies. So if you imagine a circle as all of the knowledge we know, and then kind of all through your education, you're kind of pushing your way towards that boundary, and then right at the end, you make this tiny little dip. And that's you in the last 4 years. So kind of some of the things I want to talk about in my talk are some of the smart cuts. And I don't like the word shortcut because there's a kind of like a negative connotation that you're skipping things. Whereas in a book called Smart Cuts, smart cuts are the kind of tasks or things that can accelerate what you're doing and make you more effective and efficient at what you're doing. And I wanted to apply some of the learnings I learnt through working in a business at the same time and see how that helped my research, but also how my research perspective helped kind of business. So the kind of first thing was to be inquisitive. I read a book the other day called A More Beautiful Question. And it talks about how when we're young, when we're children, we ask a lot of questions, up to 400 every day. But as we get older, we don't really ask anymore. But why? Why don't we ask any more questions? And the book kind of suspects that it's because of our education and our workplace system that rewards knowing the answer as opposed to asking the question, which creates a very kind of troubling kind of mindset, because for a PhD, you have to be good at asking questions. You have to be asking questions that challenge assumptions, that really put things out there. But there's a bit of a danger to that, and let me just play a video. Do you guys all know Louis C.K.? This guy is awesome. I don't know if we have. Okay, I don't think we've got audio, so I'll skip that. But basically, he talks about him and his. He asked a lot of questions to his kids, and then eventually it kind of got way out of hand. They were asking, why is the sky blue? Well, because of this. But why is that? And why is that? And eventually they talk about, well, I don't know because I didn't pay attention in class. Why didn't you pay attention? And then it kind of spiraled down from there. In business, there's a technique called the 5 Why principle, and it was made famous by Toyota, which used it to diagnose the root cause of a problem. So whenever something didn't work or broke down, instead of just going very shallow, what is the reason why it didn't work, they kept asking why 5 times at least until they got to the root of it. Now I think we should add on to that and not just ask why, but we should ask why, like why not, what if, and how questions. So the kind of question I asked in my PhD very early, well, this was about the first 1.5 years, was why is motion capture not affordable and ubiquitously accessible? This was a little bit different from the artificial muscle stuff that I was working on showing you before, and that was because I had found there was a potential gap in knowledge in a very niche application of this. And it was, well, it wasn't niche, but it was an application where there weren't that much people working on, and that was using that artificial muscle thing as a sensor. And I wanted to use that to measure human motion, our movement. So when we look at motion capture, traditionally this is kind of the gold standard. And it's using visual markers that you place on the body, and you typically have cameras that measure the relative spatial movement between each of these positions. And now you can even have markerless systems as well. But the kind of difficulty is that it's all confined to either a room with a green screen, and there's a lot of computer equipment. So you can't really take this stuff outside. Like if I wanted to go for a run, I couldn't just go out and have somebody carry that with me. There's lots of other solutions to this. So one is a wearable thing, and some of the guys, I know Mark and Tor, are working on this, which is a initial measurement unit, and that measures things like acceleration, velocity, all that kind of good stuff. But the thing that really interested me was I realized that we all wear clothes, and what if we could like integrate the sensors directly into the fibers, into the material that we wear, kind of like a compression kit clothing. Like here's an athlete wearing skins, and I've got skins myself, and I can imagine that this material could be embedded into the clothes, and that way when an athlete runs around or does anything, we can actually capture that motion and give them feedback. So what are some of the materials that people have been working with? What we've kind of found is that the whole world in our small little bubble community is moving in one way, and we're kind of like looking at the other way. So the way that they're kind of moving about it is with really expensive, exotic materials. So here's like a gold electrode material. Here's the top one is a special corrugation pattern, kind of like a rooftop. And all of this stuff works quite well, but it's very expensive. Whereas the kind of direction that we're looking at is, this is the kind of material that we work with, and that's carbon. So carbon is one of the most abundant things you can find. When you burn your barbecue, that creates carbon. And we make our original materials using carbon powder particles and embedded into a silicone membrane. But that had a lot of problems. So although it was very abundant, it was it was readily accessible, it was economic, but it had a really high electro resistance, which is a terrible electrical property, or so we thought, for conventional sensing methods. So here's a quote that I really love. The voyage of discovery is not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. And I think one of the things we discovered was this really bad material actually turned out to be really good in another kind of way. And I'll talk about that in a second. So one of the things I did early was not to do a literature review. So one of the things I think traditionally when you enter a PhD is in the first year you're meant to cover a lot of the prior art or all the research that's been done. I did a fair amount of it, but I spent more time tinkering with things, working with the guys, and just getting my hands dirty. And the reason was, one of the things I realized was that if I followed everything that was in literature and publication, then there may be a possibility that I become tunnel vision into the same kind of perspective and thinking and what everybody else is thinking. And here's a famous quote about, it ain't so much the things that we don't know that gets us into trouble, it's the things we know that just ain't so. And so I was worried that if I had followed everything that everybody else had done in the field, that I would start thinking the same way that they would and not challenge some of those core assumptions. So don't let literature review frame your ideas. One of the things I started doing was, I mentioned, working on a lot of side projects. Here's one that we really liked. This was David and Andrew here. The guys, I think, spent a couple of days just cooking up this explosive material, because we work with all this material, and they wanted to create a rocket. So we took it to the domain, and I remember that night we had this debate about where to point this rocket, where to direction it, because on one side there was the hospital, and the other side was like this whole bunch of trees in the domain. So we ended up pointing straight up. Unfortunately, due to aerodynamics, this thing didn't fly, but it was fun. We learned a lot. So in my first year, I spent a lot of time upskilling myself, and that was always the kind of intention. It wasn't that I was going to make lots and lots of progress towards solving my problem, but I was going to develop all the skills I need to eventually help me solve my problem. And I literally worked on every single project I could get my hands on. I helped all the guys in the lab worked on all of their own PhDs for a bit, and that almost acted like I had a personal mentor or coach who could show me all of the different things. And looking back, kind of looking back at my PhD and everything I've done in my thesis, it all seems really trivial now. But I guarantee, like back at the time, it wasn't. And I think the difference is it took that 3.5 years of experience to develop that. And that's where I think the first year of developing your skill set means a lot. So in line with more kind of side project, here's another one that really took off for us. And also in my first year, I teamed up with Ming and 2 other guys, and we entered into a technology competition called the Microsoft Imagine Cup. And this was a student technology competition designed to challenge students to use computers, software, and solve challenging problems. And the problem we decided to tackle was skin cancer. So these are pictures of people taken using a UV camera, and the black spots on their faces show signs of early skin damage. And if untreated, this could lead to skin cancer. And we were trying to figure out why a lot of people in New Zealand were getting this, even though over 90% of this can be prevented. We have lots of preventative measures, but why aren't people protecting themselves? And we realized that one of the things was people were getting burnt because they had no idea how strong the UV conditions were, which is not the same as how strong the sun is. Because the sun has lots and lots of different wavelengths, and only a particular part of it actually burns you. And that means that you can even get burnt when it's cloudy and when it's really cold. So we won the New Zealand finals, and we went over to St. Petersburg in Russia. We made the news, and unfortunately we didn't win the competition, but I remember walking out that day and knowing that this is the stuff I want to work on. So while in Russia, I did a lot of fun things. I met a grizzly bear. We found out you have to leave your guns at the door when you walk into any shop. And occasionally strangers put money in your pockets. It turned out that the Russians had so much money that everything is made out of gold over there. When we got back, I got a call from Jeff Witcher from the business school, and he had heard about our Imagine Cup success there, and he asked whether or not we should enter into the Spark competition, which now is called the Velocity competition, and that's a business competition run at the business school. So we entered into that. We won the Ideas Challenge, but again, unfortunately, we didn't win the grand prize. But the process of going through the 6 or so weeks of, I think it's called the Launchpad program, that really helped us build out the business model. So again, one of the skills I learnt along the way was actually a really difficult thing for me, and that was how to have a really difficult conversation with somebody. And along the time, we had one of our teammates who he wasn't pulling his weight in what we were all doing, and we were all trying to build this thing and make it grow, and we had one guy who didn't meet his responsibilities. One of the best books I've ever read on this is called Crucial Confrontation and Conversations. It's a duo there, and it talks about how the most important thing about maintaining trust is meeting those expectations, managing those expectations, because violating an expectation like a commitment is the biggest thing that kills trust. And without trust in a team, that is the worst kind of place you can be. And so when I talked to our teammate, the first thing I did was I just talked to him about all the things that he had kind of agreed that he was going to do, and then got him to realize that he wasn't meeting his expectations. And then it actually turned out to be quite an easy conversation, and ultimately we parted ways, but it was really fair, and he was happy with it, and we were all happy as well. So we've done a lot of stuff in Imagine Cup, working on side projects along the way, and then you look at your unit email list, and you get all this like stuff in your spam folder. So I had a whole bunch of reports overdue. So I kind of ignored that for a while. So went on to another commercial job. It turned out one of the jobs we were working on was a sought-after piece of equipment from a university in Canada called Sherbrooke. And they wanted this piece of sensing equipment that I was building for this MRI robot that they were building. And basically it's like a laser-guided needle system, and there are some of the sensors that I was developing and the technology behind that. That project blew way over deadlines. I think we went like 3 months over the deadline or something, and I just kept building and building. We actually did get paid for this, but I think the hours worked out really poorly. But I didn't really care, because I was having lots of fun. I was learning every day trying to deliver on this project. And we ultimately sold a few more of these to a lab in Switzerland, and I learned about tech support, and not just like phone tech support, but like video tech support. So we had Ian over there in Switzerland, and we had like the Skype call where he'll hold up the camera and show up like a whole bunch of wires and ask me what to do, and I kind of look back at a data sheet and try to figure out, okay, Ian, cut the green wire, things like that. That was really cool. But building on this project, we made a whole bunch of games. So what I actually developed was a way to measure the position of each one of these sensors. And so here's one that we used to make a joystick controller. And as a kid, I loved playing games at the arcade, but I hated that mechanical joystick. And so we made a really soft version of that, which is essentially just a piece of rubber film, and you could touch and move with your finger. On the other side is a glove controller that I developed with Andy, and it's basically like a hand control mechanism to play a game. And the game we chose was one of our favorites, Doom. Back in 1993, this game was hot. So basically the game is controlled by you moving your hand and doing gestures like pointing somewhere and pulling your index finger to shoot. So we had a lot of fun making games. At the same time, after this, we hugely delivered on this. We all took a break and celebrated, and Ellen and I went to Hawaii, and we walked into a volcano. This was hot. One of the things I found along the way was you really have to learn good at telling people your story, and just I don't really believe in luck, but one of the things I've learned is this thing called the luck surface area, and it's something that you can control. And it basically says all the things that you don't expect to happen is defined by 2 dimensions, and it's how many people you tell about your idea and how well you tell your idea. And those are both things that you could do yourself, right? So from that, we met Richard, one of our co-founders of our business now. We've developed a whole bunch of new ideas and met new people. This was actually how I met my thesis examiner. We had dinner one day and he really liked what I was doing, and 3 years later he was marking my thesis. Moving on to the next kind of part was learning how to focus. This was really hard for me because I felt that there were so many ideas I wanted to work on, but I didn't have the time to work on all of them. So how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So I learned that the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And I got a phone call one day from a really good friend, Ben O'Brien, and he had walked into the lab the day before, and he must have called something out to me, but I didn't even hear him. The next day he called me, I think it was like 7 a.m. or something, he called me and he said, "Dan, when I came into the lab yesterday, you look really stressed out." Okay, I didn't realize. And he said, "I kind of know what you're going through, because when we were starting off our business, the business that eventually spun out to become Stretch Sense, that he was in the middle of writing his thesis, and Todd was doing his thesis as well, and they realized that was just really difficult to juggle. And Ben gave me some tips about how to prioritize this, how he worked around, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. But I reflected on that day, and I realized that he was absolutely right, because I just had so many projects going on and commitments not being filled, which I hate that because that breaks trust. And so one of the first things I did was just eliminate everything that don't add value to me and to my life. So we literally don't have a TV at our flat. I very rarely watch the news, trying to get off social media as much as I can. Just anything I don't need, just simplify my life. The next day I went and read a whole book about time management, and that was really cool. And it basically talked about, if you could only do one thing right now, what is that one thing you could do that will make everything else easier or unnecessary? And that's kind of how I use to prioritize my time. While you're prioritizing, I realized that you can prioritize, but you might not prioritize in the right way if you don't have a goal that you're kind of working towards. And there's only 2 points that I think about when setting goals. And that is, what is the big, hairy, audacious goal, which we call the Mount Everest goal, and what is the next smallest milestone we have to do to get there. And the reason why it's important to have that really big vision goal is that's where you want to ultimately strive for. The one that you're kind of moving to the next corner is the one that you could do in the next day or the next week. Everything in between is just trivial. And what that does is actually simplifies your life, because you don't have to focus on anything there. And in fact, I learned to embrace ambiguity, increase kind of your tolerance level when things in that middle section go out of your control. This is another thing I love. Be regular and orderly in your life so that you may be violent and original in your work. So what that basically means is that reserve your mental energy. So here's Steve, and he wears the same clothes for 10 years, right? And what he does really well is he recognizes that there's only so much decision making we can make in a day. And if he's using that on very trivial things like what am I wearing, what should I eat, then he's losing that energy that he could be using on his work. So the kind of way to imitate that is to, one, write things down. And so I've stopped kind of remembering things because I just hated having to store facts and ideas and thoughts in my head. I like to have the comfort of knowing that I could eventually find it if I need to find it. And Albert Einstein was really famous for this because a journalist asked him for his phone number, and then he went to the phone book to look it up. And he answered by saying he didn't want to remember his phone number because it clouded his thinking. And the next thing is about making routines and habits that you could just do autonomously. So I have a couple of these I call hygiene tasks because they're as important to me as if I needed to like shower or something. And so every morning I follow this ridiculous military routine, and it involves waking up really early, doing my reading, doing my gym training, and doing my kind of planning, and then I kind of go start the day. But I realize that if I don't do any of these tasks, then my day kind of goes downhill. And so every morning, this kind of getting into these routines, and now that I get so good at it, I could do these routines without having to think about it. So back to the piece of advice that Ben gave me about time management. And it was really about, we all recognize that time is probably the most resource that we have. But why do we let emails dictate our lives? I entered into this, kind of split my day into 3 phases. And that worked really well for me, especially during the thesis writing mode. Because we were getting phone calls coming in from customers and had to handle support. There were lots of design work we had to do. There was other people you had to talk to, and they wanted to get hold of you in the mornings. I literally just turned my phone off, flight mode, took away all emails, and morning I just do this thing where I'm a producer. And what I do is I just focus on the one thing that I need to do the most in my whole day, and that's to finish my thesis. So I get up, and the first thing I do is I aim to hit 1,000 words. And I've been talking to Ming about this. 1,000 words is like kind of, I believe, the amount of words you could squeeze creatively out of a person before it turns to junk. So I get my 1,000 words done, and that's usually around lunchtime. And then afterwards, I'm in kind of like firefighting damage control mode, where it's let's catch up on all the conversations I needed to have, all the people I needed to talk to. Now's the time to do it. And then in the evening, I would go into kind of like a learner state, where I realized that the reason why I couldn't get all my tasks done was because I wasn't effective enough during the day. So how could I get more effective? And so I'd chuck on my learning hat, and I'll go read, I'll go talk to people, I'll go ask questions, I'll go to networking events, and I'll go experiment things. Just every little bit way that I could find that could make me improve. Here's a book that I really liked, and it was about, it's a book written by an Olympic champion called Ben Hunt Davis from the Great Britain team. And he had this motto of, will it make the boat go faster? I think Sir Peter Blake used this for the America's Cup race. But basically one of his things was, don't focus on the end result. And a lot of people get focused so fixated on that end result they want to achieve, they actually forget how to do it, how to get there. And so the author of this book, Ben, he absolutely believed in the process behind getting those results. So if our goal is to finish our PhD, and I don't know how to do that, but I know that one of the skills I need to develop is to improve my writing skills, and I'll go write 1,000 words a day. If I know that I need to go solve this problem, then I'll know that the next thing I need to do is just experiment like crazy every day, day after day, and improve my experimentation techniques. This guy, Ben, he trained so hard for some of the stuff. He talked about how he missed all these weddings, and some days after training he'll have to take a chair into the shower because he's so tired to stand up. I'm not sure what will it means, but this is the kind of attitude that an Olympic champion has. The next thing I learned was how to say no. And I think this is important because we have lots of good friends and people that come up to us and ask us for our time. But realistically, we don't have the time to help everybody. And so one of the projects which I really wish I wanted to be part of but I just couldn't, was something actually really close to Ian. And that was the Taniwha. And this is a submarine that the guys are building. It's spectacular. They're taking it to England in a couple of months for an international race. That was really difficult for me because I knew that this was a cool project. Ian was really excited. I was kind of excited as well. But then I realized that if I was going to commit to this, everything else would just become mediocre. One of the rules we follow with in our ideas brainstorm session is this thing called a 10x rule. So I have a lot of book recommendations because I think people should be reading. So 10x rule is kind of this idea that whatever you're building needs to be at least 10 times better in any way, whether it's cheaper, faster, lighter, or in any way. And if you're not working on 10 times better, then it's going to be very difficult to get your customers to change to a new platform or to a new system. And when I met the Google team last year, I was really honored to meet the Google X team, which is the team that brought you Google Glass and all this other crazy self-driving cars. They have this idea called a moonshot. And basically they only work on projects that are like going to the moon, that are so wacky and out there, and if it's not crazy enough, they won't go into it. So you might ask why? Well, it actually turns out that if your idea is so big and so audacious, it's much easier to gain support. And you could raise money easier, you could get people behind you to help you work on it, and you have huge amounts of motivation to work on this. So following our 10x rule, the question we ask is, out of all of our ideas, will it make TechCrunch? And we kind of almost did. One of the things we did, got onto Engadget. Here is a wide article of one of the latest creations we've come up with. Ming will be able to tell you a lot more about that. After that, I went to Mexico. This is the kind of US to Mexico border, and it's just like an open door. There are no security guards. You could just literally walk across. Once you get to the other side of Mexico, you realize that there are lots of stores, from selling you border solutions to drugs. I got fed a lot of tequila, and I don't remember anything after that. This is a quote about being bold, and it's about how guys who dream during the day are the people who make things happen. This is a chart I just discovered a while ago, and it talks about in terms of time and the kind of maturity of a technology level. And so usually when a new technology is discovered, it rises up to this inflated expectations that's created by the media or anybody else trying to boost this technology. And then it comes down through this trough of disillusionment before it slowly rises up again. And where I think startup businesses or new businesses need to operate is on that slope of enlightenment, where they're making revenue straight from day one. They can't afford to be working on something that's going to have a fall and then last like 5 years before they make their first dollar. But this is where I think university and research is really important, because if we only had startups operating in the world, then everything in the world would just be working on short-term problems. We need people in research in the universities to be solving these really big, grand, audacious problems that don't yet have a monetary return. And that's right up at the early cycle. The way to do that is to not be afraid to try. And pro ice skaters have this thing where they take twice as many falls as all the average ice skaters out there, because they're the ones experimenting. So what you really find is, wherever your map of your kind of comfort zone is, outside is where the magic is. After learning that, we got on another plane. You get the trend kind of what we're doing in the last couple of years. This is really cool. We took this small charter plane, and I was coming back from Vegas. A friend was driving me there, and we were running so late for this plane. But fortunately, they couldn't take off without me because I was 1/4 of the passengers. And you can see once the plane took off, we were just taking selfies the whole time. The place we wanted to go to was this. This is one of the most classic rocks, mountains ever, called the Yosemite's, the Half Dome. And it's called the Half Dome because it's like a rock that's been cut in half and it's just sheer cliff. There was no way we were going to climb up this vertical side, So we trekked like 3 or 4 hours around the back, trying to get to the other side. And there's me and Tony posing in front of this risky sign. We literally had no equipment. We didn't have any proper gear, shoes, or anything, but we want to get to the top. One of the things we realized was that even though it kind of looked risky, risk is kind of like a perceived kind of thing. There's Tony kind of making his way up on a cable. See, for me, in that time, that instant, I looked at that mountain and I went, that's not for me. Whereas for Tony, that was a complete different kind of thing. So even though it was the same mountain, he had a completely different perception about risk. I just want to touch on risk a bit more, because I believe there are 4 types of risks. There are risks that you can afford to take, and ones that you can't afford to take, or you can't afford not to take. But the last one here is actually my favorite. It's risks you cannot afford not to take. And these things are, it's basically the consequence of inaction. It's the fact of you not doing something is itself a risk. And entrepreneurs are really good at de-risking, eliminating risks. They're always looking for ways to expand their options, create alternative pathways. One of the things you can mitigate risk is, I learned this about, you have to ask for things. Because when you ask for things, you get more options presented to you. And one of the things we struggle with was hitting deadlines for conference papers. Because usually, just before a conference, we have all of the stuff we wanted to publish, but we hadn't sought any intellectual property protection. And so every time we would have to ask the editors, can we get an extension, can we get an extension? And every time we got one. And so that's something that wouldn't have happened if we didn't ask. Here's a really good book about handling those kind of rejections. There's a guy who, he quit his job and he wanted to become an entrepreneur, but he was so terrified of asking for things, asking for customers, and then he went on to this rejection therapy thing where he would just randomly ask people really hard things. And it's the idea of if you were to punch a concrete block repeatedly for 100 days, you would have fists of steel. And so this guy went out and just asked really ridiculously things. So the first day he asked a security guard for $100, said no. But then he asked stuff like, can I have crusty donuts made into the Olympic rings, like interlocked together, which they delivered. He asked a random guy in Texas, where you could get shot in Texas, whether or not he could play soccer in the guy's backyard. and the guy let him. He asked a police officer to take a ride in the police car while posing as a cop, and he got away with it. So there's lots of ways he handled his rejections. Here's a technique about how to make the ask, and it's about how not to write an email. And and I learned this from Richard when I was kind of writing my own sales version of emails, and it always starts kind of really bad like this. It goes, "Hi, my name is, and I'm working on da-da-da, and I'm interested in this." Now this is a really terrible way to write an email, because first you don't acknowledge the person's name, but then you realize that everything is about you. It's my name is, I'm working on, I'm interested. It's nothing to do with what the other person is interested in. So this is kind of like a different alternative. So you go, "Hi, Jane, your article on something was really interesting. I like how you did this." What you're showing there is that you've invested the time to go and research about someone else's work. Then you go, "I'm working on a similar idea I think you might be interested in," and always have kind of like an end goal. This is kind of why you're making this ask. I learned it's better to beg for forgiveness than ask for permission. So we went out to Hawaii another time, and we went swimming with the turtles. And in Hawaii, you're not allowed to touch the turtles. But our guy didn't care, and he swam under a rock and pulled this guy out and got us all to take photos of it. So I'm not saying that's the right thing to do, but sometimes, hey, what do you do when you get like an ethics thing? Finding motivation. I had a lot of childhood heroes. This was one of them. This is Goku fighting Frieza on Namek. Favorite kind of character. But then I have a lot of real world heroes. This is a guy really inspired me. His name is Paul Farmer, and he's a doctor who spends most of his time working in Tahiti, curing patients of tuberculosis. Here's an Antarctic explorer, Douglas Mawson, and he's an Aussie guy who went over to the Antarctic and almost died so many times, came back after like a month of no food, starvation by himself, and found his way back home in search of the magnetic South Pole. So these guys have incredible internal motivation. Why is that? So it kind of turns out that we have the old kind of motivation mechanism of carrots and sticks versus the new kind of motivation, which is creating your own autonomy of things, having your own internal reason for doing something, trying to become a master at something, and having a purpose that is larger than yourself. So one of the questions I kept asking was, why am I doing this PhD? There are kind of basic reasons out there, such as making a contribution, but I felt that for me, the most important one was kind of embracing this risk, to going out there, putting myself out there into this uncertainty, not knowing that there's going to be an answer at the end. And I thought that was really different because all throughout my school years, you're told that there's a model answer at the end. For every exam I've ever taken, there was always a correct answer. But when you're doing something in research, that may never exist. And I felt that going out there, putting myself out to do that, that's a huge gain in my confidence. So sometimes you have to jump to get started. We have this thing in the lab about eating beetroots. We spice it up with chilies. Here's Simon not reacting very well. And don't be afraid to fail on these kind of things. I'm going to go through some of these slides quite quick. Don't worry about getting stuck, because the only people that don't get stuck are those that aren't doing anything. One of the things I've learned a lot was about developing this growth mindset. And there's a famous researcher, Carol, and she did a study about just kids right at the beginning. And she asked them, can you make this toy? And some of the students went, no, I can't do that. Whereas some other ones went, not yet. So in the latter half, the kids who went not yet have this really awesome growth mindset, knowing that maybe perhaps at the moment they can't do something, but ultimately they will be able to. I'm going to skip that one. Does anybody know what this is? This is an initial refrigeration system. But it was poorly designed because it was heavy, it was clunky, and it made ice that was terrible. And this is how they actually made ice before they made that machine. And basically they went out into lakes and they cut blocks out of ice and they put it onto a ship and they wrapped it in straw and shipped it across the world. But what happened was that ice technology was kind of hitting a plateau where the new technology, although not yet exceeding that, had the potential to improve. But it's really difficult to go up and raise momentum for this kind of stuff and improve. So one of the techniques you could apply is this lean methodology, and it's about testing for everything, and famous books about this kind of stuff. And we ask this question all the time about what is the quickest, cheapest, dirtiest way we could get to the next answer. So all throughout kind of doing my PhD and also working in the UV idea was that we built quick prototypes. This took a couple of months to make, but it started off with a whiteboard drawing and then me drawing something on paint and going out into preschools and validating that idea. We did this on hardware as well, where we just built prototype after prototype. And when the going got really hard, we stayed up all night making stuff. But we shipped. These are our early customers. So we worked with preschools, kids who we put a sensor up on their playground and that measure how strong the UV conditions were and send that information to an iPad, and the teachers could then know when to take the kids outside, when to bring them back in. We launched on Halloween, where Helen helped and install one of the sensors. Okay, prepare for things that could go wrong. A lot of the times you realize that there are so many things out of your control, but there are things that are also in your control. These are things like your commitment to something, your attitude to something, the love and integrity you have. So this was one of the experiments that didn't work, well, actually broke when we got to a conference. And this was meant to be a special type of generator that generated electricity. When we got there, the whole thing broke, and we modified this luggage rack. So Dan pulled that apart, and then we built this new demo. And that was awesome because it worked. We also found out that the US has really large pizzas, the size of a bed. I'm going to skip some of this stuff. So this is a cow, more cows. This is a purple cow. And so the idea is that if you are just a cow, doing everything else that everyone else is doing, then it's actually a very risky way to stand out. And so the way to stand out is to be remarkable. Okay, so one of the things that helped me along the way was publishing my work. And there's a really good book on this stuff called Influence. And it talks about 6 principles of influencing. And one of the things I realized was I could offer reciprocity. So this is giving someone something first, and then they'll offer something back. And so usually that was when I reached out to editors and I just complimented them on something that they did. Or I read something that they had published and I offered them a compliment. And then they felt that they would then spend the time and read my email or do something. And I call them out on consistency, because people have a natural tendency to be consistent to their prior actions. So when you're trying to publish your work, reference all of the papers that are similarly published in your field, and all the work that's quite similar to what you've done, yet they publish. Then they'll have to be consistent to publish that work as well. Create some social proof, show that you have other people looking at this work. There's patent pending stuff on this. Authority, liking scarcity. Scarcity was awesome. So before I publish all of my, before I submit it to a journal, I would actually look up all of the competing journals that those journals have, and I'll search up all of the impact factors, and I'll state to the editors and say, these are some of the journals I've considered, but I really like your one first. Can you have a look? And often these editors, they will come back and they'll just sidetrack and shortcut, and I'll get straight through. Be concise. This was the shortest paper I've ever seen. There's actually 0 text. One of the reviewers studied this for a while, and he said he studied this with lemon juice and x-rays and could not detect a single flaw. Oh, here's an important one. I think one of the things we get kind of bogged down on is describing things in terms of features and not in benefits, and especially engineers. So, for instance, we talk about things in terms of milliamp hours, whereas you should be talking about what the benefit is to somebody. Avoid these buzzwords because it's not you that will tell whether it's novel or innovative. Let other people describe that. The research proposition, unique selling point, which is one of the benefits of the research I worked on, was I was trying to remove all of these wires in any of these sensing systems. So the thing I wanted to create was like a body suit, motion capture suit, but it had all of these wires accompanying it. So we developed this really clever mechanism that sends different electrical signals into the material, and it would figure out where you're pressing it locally and where that local deformation is happening, and then we could then infer, using a single set of wires, what the person was doing. So we got a whole bunch of downloads on that paper. We wrote some patents. I'll skip out stretch sense and Cuba.
You have about 4 minutes, Dan.
Yeah. So I created a lot of slides because there was just so much work to cover, all the stuff we did. I just want to kind of thank everybody, actually. So over the last kind of 4 years, it's been a really rich learning experience for myself. And I could put these slides up later so you guys can look in it in more detail later on. But first I want to thank Ian, because Ian was the person who came down to the engineering department 4 years ago, and he told me about the lab and the kind of material or the work that everybody was working on. My co-supervisor Shane, who's not here, the guys in the lab who literally has been my family, Peter Hunter, who, and I remember when Peter gave us some office space to work in, had one requirement, and that one requirement was that both me and Ming would finish our PhDs. So we're on track. And Jeff and Spark at the Spark Velocity competition, all of our business partners we've worked with, but also Richard and Ming, who I work in the business together, and they've given me so much support along the way, and I really look forward to the next chapter of my life working with you guys. So thank you guys.
Thank you, Dan. Any questions on that? He managed to actually write a thesis as well. We didn't hear very much about that, but the thesis was extremely well received by the overseas examiner. He's been he got the top tick on that, so we'll see how well he goes. He hadn't sat his viva yet, but I don't think it's going to be a difficult job. But Dan's managed to put a whole new axis on the artificial muscle sensing graph, and the axis is frequency. He's able to actually, without having a whole lot of different discrete sensors in a block of this rubber, you can have a single block of rubber, and just by using frequency on two directions, as he showed you there, he's able to work out where you've touched it. You can turn it into a musical keyboard, and that's actually created quite a lot of publicity lately. But anyway, I think he gave you sort of like a nice other side of PhD life, which I think all of you could probably benefit from, and I think I could benefit from some of this myself too, because I don't know how to say no and stuff like that too, so I'm going to take that to heart too. So anyway, thank you very much, Dan, and you can eat the food and talk to him later.
Yeah, thanks guys.